My name is Barry Erickson, and I'm Community Engagement Coordinator at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we are delighted to bring you this presentation on natural areas restoration. In her role as Education Program Coordinator with the DuPage Forest Preserve, Sharon Burns works to engage people in nature through the many programs and activities available at the forest preserves throughout DuPage County. With over 30 years of experience working in public service, education, community outreach, and as a natural resources volunteer, Sharon believes that the outdoors, especially here in DuPage County, offers something for everyone. Shannon has been an area resident since 1981 and is an active user of the district's trails, so maybe you've seen her out there. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Shannon, and I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share, Shannon, so you can start discussing all the wonderful information that you have for us tonight. So you should be seeing this.
Okay, thank you, Barry. I'm Shannon Burns from the Forest Preserve District, and we are going to talk tonight about natural area restoration, what we manage, why we do it, and how it's done. I also just want to preface this by giving you my email address. It's sburns, B-U-R-N-S, at dupageforest.org. And the reason you should have that is because I have a link that can tell you where the spring ephemeral wildflowers are blooming. And if you want to have that, it's kind of lists all the preserves and what you're likely to see there in the next couple of weeks. If you send me an email, I will get that link right out to you. So let's start by talking about the forest preserve and what we do, how it's done. What you see here are 4 seasons in the same location. I went out and took a photograph at each quarter, so all of the seasons. This is the same piece of land, and it's important to just look at this and see how things change, as you know, in nature over and over, and they're constantly in flux. The forest preserve itself is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year operation. Nature doesn't sleep, and so we don't either. So if Barry could advance the slide. Our mission at the Forest Preserve is to acquire and hold lands that contain forests, prairies, wetlands, and plant communities, and then lands capable of being restored to natural conditions for the purpose of protecting the flora, fauna, and scenic beauty. And we do that for the education and pleasure and recreation of DuPage County citizens. One of the things is people always think that we are an environmental agency, and in fact, the Forest Preserve is not. We certainly are interested in the environment, and we do what we can to protect it and restore it. But our organization, our charter for over 100 years has been that we are a land management agency. So when you see us doing something like recycling or composting or having an event to show people how to do that, that's kind of a secondary mission. Our primary mission is to manage the land. And tonight I'm going to explain to you how we do that. So we're ready for the next slide. Let's talk about what we're talking about when we talk about the forest preserve. So we were the second forest preserve in the country to have a charter, 1915. I'm sorry, we were the 5th one in the United States. DuPage County was the first. We were organized officially as a land management agency in 1915, so we've had over 100 years. As of 2018, we have 26,000 acres of land. Now that's important because it's about 12% of DuPage County is dedicated to forest preserve land. And what that means is that land can never again be sold and put back into the property tax producing base. So when land is dedicated to the forest preserve, it is protected in perpetuity. What that means is the citizens of DuPage County, first of all, own that land. But secondly, they have made in DuPage County a huge commitment to take 12% of the property in the county out of the income base and just have it available for people to enjoy. We have over 145 miles of trail now. We have 60 preserves. We have over 30 lakes. Many of them are stocked with fish. If you are a fisher person, you can certainly send me an email and I can get you a list of our lakes and what we stock in them. We have 47 miles of rivers and streams, and we have over 1 million citizens to enjoy all of this. While Barry is advancing to the next slide, I will tell you that 78% of the citizens in DuPage County live within 1 mile of a trail. So again, we're really, really fortunate here to have so much open space. So when we say natural area restoration, one of the first things you want to think is what makes area natural? I mean, is your backyard natural, or is the back part of a parking lot where there's some grass, is that a natural area? Well, there's specific definitions in the science world of natural area restoration. So there's a couple of criteria. The first criteria is to call land natural is that it the type of land. It has to be able to be defined technically as a woodland or a savanna or a wetland or a prairie or a wet prairie. So you can decide for yourself if the land is a woodland or a savanna. You go out and lay down on the ground under a bunch of trees, and if all you can see is 10% or less sky through the tree canopy, what you've got is a woodland. So in a woodland, less than 10% of the sky can be seen from in the woods. If you lay down on the ground in a savanna, you will look up and you'll see 40 to 60% of the sky is available to be seen because the tree canopy is less dense. And of course, when you're in a prairie, you're lucky if you see a tree. So that's one of the ways we define things. Wetlands and wet prairies are actually two other forms of natural land that we have a different talk for. But basically, wetlands stay wet all the time, and wet prairies are kind of they go between actually soggy and damp, but very rarely are they ever dry, where an actual prairie is frequently dry. So as we move to the next slide, the next criteria that we talk about is the habitat. So in addition to the type of land, we have to look at habitat. So a natural area would have a habitat that supports native plants, now native to the area. If we were in Florida, native plants would be different than the ones we have up here. A habitat also has to support indigenous creatures. So for here in Illinois, in the northern part of Illinois, it would support foxes and coyotes and beavers and butterflies. Those are the indigenous creatures that were here 200 and 300 years ago on this chunk of land. And then in order for a habitat to be a natural habitat, it has to support on its own, it has to support a natural balance between the native plants and the indigenous creatures. So as we move to the next slide, there's a third criteria, and that is the purpose. So land that is a woodland or a wetland or meets the definition of natural land and has the kind of habitat that supports critters and native plants, the purpose of the land also has to fit a criteria. So natural land has a purpose of maintaining balance between native plants and indigenous creatures, and also between the human beings that live in the islands of developed land in between areas of natural areas. It also has to have a purpose of restoring endangered species. So natural areas are restored in such a way that endangered species will be able to survive and grow and hopefully get off the endangered list. Natural areas also have to promote public safety, and they do that in many ways, but for example, reducing flooding and reducing accidents. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Natural areas, by definition, have a purpose of improving property value. There are statistics that you can look up online that tell you exactly how much your property value improves depending on how close you are to a trail that will support walking and biking. But there's a definite improvement in value when you are near a trail. And then it also has to have a purpose of promoting recreation and wellness for the public that lives around the natural area. So as we move to the next slide, natural areas are not just random pieces of land. They're lands that meet those criteria that we just talked about. So Illinois is an interesting forest preserve because it's actually not a forest state. Illinois is right on the the eastern edge of the west moving prairie state. If you look at this map and you look all the way over to the east coast, you can see how densely wooded it was when the settlers came and moved into those east coast states. Some of them eventually in the late 1700s, early 1800s, decided to start moving west, and they got to Illinois where the land started to open up and there weren't trees everywhere, and they saw the beginning of the Great Plains and the Great Prairies. And they thought, well, we're just going to stay here because this is a good place to farm and settle. We don't have so many trees. What happens with that, though, is we get a spiral. If you look at the very top of this red spiral on the screen, you can see that one of the first things that happened is we have prairies, and prairies have a lot of water in them, whether they're wet prairies or whether they're just regular prairies. They are designed to take up water. Well, if someone decides they're going to sit here and make a living farming, they have to install drain tiles way back in the early 1800s to siphon the water off the land so that the crops will not get soggy and they'll grow. Well, what that did was allowed for more farmland, but it allowed for increased development around the farms. Every time you get a cluster of farms, you have to have a general store, and you have to have roads, and you have to have a railroad. So the development increased, and every time you have development increasing, you're paving over natural prairies. So we've already kind of destroyed the natural balance in the prairie by siphoning off the water. Now we're further destroying it by putting down structures that are not going to move. So the water has nowhere to go and it dumps into the prairie, which no longer does its natural draining. It now drains in the way that we have directed it to via man-made tiles. Next thing that happened is natural fires became controlled. Um, the Native Americans who were here originally, whenever a prairie was set on fire by lightning or intentionally, it would burn off all the debris. Some seeds require fire in order to germinate in the next year. And of course, animal habitats need certain kinds of debris, not any kind of random debris. So natural fires help to control that. What happened was natural fires were controlled in the area because people would put them out. If a fire started on their farm, they would put it out. But also, the more development we have, the more fires can't start because of a lightning strike landing in a prairie is going to catch something and start a blaze. A lightning strike landing on a piece of pavement is going to leave a burned area, but it's not going to catch the pavement on fire. Well, all of that led to increased flooding. The flooding led to increased soil erosion. Increased soil erosion allowed to invasive species take hold and start growing. And that all led to a loss of habitat so that native plants and native critters began to decline. So natural area restoration is kind of walking that back by taking out the drain tiles, protecting land from development, starting our own fires, which then decreases flooding. We can help the soil erosion repair itself. We can clear out invasive growth, and then the native plants and the native critters begin to come back. So moving to the next slide. Why do we bother with natural area restoration? And the answer completely is for the public that we all live together in this. And remember, one of the definitions of natural areas is recreation and health of the public. So we do this kind of natural restoration so that you can come out and enjoy the preserves, but also because it helps with flooding, it helps with air quality. There's a lot of reasons besides just recreation that allow for this, that allow natural areas that have been restored to be healthy for people. So the next slide will show us that humans are the greatest threat to nature's balance. You can talk about pesticides, and I agree they're a problem, but that's another whole talk. You can talk about deer management. You can talk about West Nile virus. You can talk about all kinds of things that are a threat to the emerald ash borer, all of those are a threat to nature. But the reality is humans are the greatest threat to nature's balance. And that's because we mow lawns. Lawns have very short roots, so there's nothing to soak up rainwater in a lawn. We mow them, which pollutes the air with gasoline. And when we have grass, we're not allowing native plants that are better for the environment to grow. Of course, when you have humans, we have to live somewhere and we have to eat. So yes, farming does put plants in the ground, but those are not native plants, and they also disrupt the natural nutrition that's in the soil when you have native plants kind of working together. And of course, we need homes that require driveways and require sidewalks. So humans are really the greatest threat to nature's balance. So we don't want humans to go away, of course, and we certainly should be living somewhere and having yards that we enjoy working in and eating foods that come from farms. But a way to restore nature's balance is to look at the forest preserve as a mechanism, as a primary mechanism to manage our land in a way that restores nature's balance so that we can, in a way, have the best of both worlds. So next slide. Natural area management that the forest preserve does mitigates the impact of humans. You see here one of the slides is a drain tile, an area where there was a drain tile and the little stream there has become channelized. We also have grass, which is like probably the worst thing you can put in your yard. These days, I used to live in Naperville a long time ago and I wanted to put in a ground cover of chamomile instead of grass, and the city wouldn't let me do it, but I bet these days they would. Chamomile smells good. It comes up every year. It can tolerate light foot traffic and it has much deeper roots and it smells nice when you walk on it. So if you're thinking about replacing your grass with something healthier, try some chamomile. We also have here a picture of buckthorn, which is an invasive species that just grows like crazy. It poisons the ground around it so that nothing else will grow. And the native birds that are important for natural balance of bugs and other plants can't eat the berries. So what we get in are birds that are not quite as good for the environment who can eat the berries. And then of course there's garbage. There's litter and garbage that humans get in the way. And we host things like the river cleanup and we put trails, and we have trail patrols who are out picking up litter. So all of these things are part of our natural area management. But let's dig a little deeper into this, starting with the next slide. Our strategies involve 5 main activities: restoration and mitigation, which is what we're going to talk about the most tonight. We also do seed collection and invasive species removal, and I'll make a plug. We always need volunteers for that. We do prescribed burning. We do some critter management and endangered species recovery that is honestly the stuff of science fiction. And I'm going to tell you just a few of the things we do. It's so interesting. So let's go to the next slide and start talking about restoration and mitigation. Any kind of restoration or mitigation project always begins with identifying a problem. So we don't sit around and look at our land and decide what to restore. Rather, we sit around and look at where the problems have been or where they're likely to be, and then we start from there. So I don't know about any of you, but I was living in downtown Naperville when that flood of 1996 hit. We got something like 100 inches of rain in a ridiculously small amount of time, and everything flooded. So what happened at that point was the Forest Preserve, the DuPage County Board, um, they have a stormwater committee, and all of the villages, the city of Naperville and some of the other communities got together and said, what happened here? So at our next slide, we start looking at what happened. And the first thing about any kind of natural area restoration is that everybody has to work together. Literally every project we do requires interagency cooperation. So if you see the forest preserve digging somewhere or cutting down a tree or taking out a trail and relocating it, it's not just us. That had to happen. What went into every action that you see the forest preserve do was at least 6 to 8 years of pre-planning with other agencies. And another interesting thing, when people see the Forest Preserve doing projects, immediately people think, oh no, my property taxes are going to go up. But the truth is, by state law, for 100 years, the Forest Preserve cannot even get a permit. We can't start the permitting process for a project until 100% of the money needed for that project is dedicated in the bank, sitting in escrow, not to be touched except for that project. Now, it's one thing to kind of wrap your head around the idea that we have to have the funding before we get started. But the reality is, before we can even go to get one permit, the funding has to be sitting aside and ready for this project. Permitting for forest preserve projects can take up to 8 years and cost as much as $1 million. If any of you remember back in about 2012, we did what we called a mega project up at North Avenue and between North Avenue and Army Trail Road and Fair Oaks Road by Carroll Stream up there. That project took just over 8 years to permit, and there are 12 books that are thicker than 8 inches each, filled with all the permits that had to happen. So I'm going to talk some more about those permits. But if you see a project happening and it's near your home and you get worried that us taking out drain tiles or remeandering a river is now going to cause flooding in your basement or in your yard, we have to prove at multiple levels of government that our project is not going to change the flow of water in the area in any way. So you're protected not just by our scientists and our engineers doing the work, but you're protected in the pre-planning stage from water flooding as a result of a project that we do. And if you ever wonder about that, send me an email and I will put you in touch with the people who handle the permits or the people who supervise the restoration work, because we want you to know what we're doing and we want you to know that there's science behind it. So let's dig into this a little more in the next slide. We had what I just mentioned, the West Branch Mega Project. It was the largest restoration in a single area ever attempted in Illinois, and it went smoothly. It's a beautiful area. You should get up there and take a walk if you haven't already. But look at the DuPage County first did aerial photography in 1932. So prior to that, we have these little hand-drawn maps with pencil. But 1939, we have an aerial drawing of the West Branch Forest Preserve. You can see the green lines, but you can also see around those green lines, there's a lot of farmland. There's not any development. So it didn't really matter much if a coyote wandered off the forest preserve property or if a deer wanted to wander off and eat vegetation. The forest preserve kind of expanded beyond its boundary just naturally. But then fast forward to 2015, look at how that same area has developed. So now what happens is if it floods and water runs off, it's going to go into your yard. If a deer needs to eat because there isn't enough vegetation left in the forest preserve, they're going to come out and eat your snapdragons. And the raccoons have nowhere to go, so they're going to come looking for your garbage. So you just look at how much the area has developed. It's lost habitat, it's lost native plants, and all of that has to be displaced and go somewhere. So then you begin to have nature creeping into your yard as a nuisance. So the next slide shows some old photos. The first thing we do before we decide how to plan for action is we take a look at existing conditions. So these are pictures from the 30s of the West Branch area where some of the farmers were putting in drain tiles in the adjacent property and cutting through the forest preserve to siphon off some of the water. Now on to the next one. You can see these drain tiles now. So we take a look at maps and we take a look at where the drain tiles were placed. We don't always know where they were placed, but what we do know is that we can hire people to come out and take a look, and we can look at old farming maps. So we do a lot of that research, and then we wander out there and take a look at how those drain tiles look today. So this is in 2014, those very drain tiles that you saw being put in the 30s in those previous pictures now look like this. So they're not doing their job. And in fact, they're creating a mess because gunk is collecting on them. It's polluting the water. The banks of the river are now having inconsistent flow. So the stream in the river is beginning to erode along the banks. Next slide. So after we've assessed all of that, and again, you can see this is that same area, the creek that runs through West Branch. If you look at the edges of the bank, you can see how channelized the stream has become. And channelization just means that it no longer twists and turns, it just zooms along because the banks have become so eroded that there's nothing stopping the water. And as the water goes rushing through downstream, it causes flooding because there's no time for for the water to soak into the natural area around it. And also, as it's zooming along, it creates more erosion, which you can see here in two different seasons. If you had gone out and taken a look at this from the other side and looked over at the color picture here with the green tree and the straw colored grass hanging over, there was actually a cave under there because it had eroded so much. So next slide. So then what we do is we go in and inventory all of the trees that are on that property. And the trees that are on that property, some of them are really fine trees, like a maple tree or a sugar maple tree. They're great trees, but they're not native to the area. And the way that we know that it's not native to the area is we do something called a soil bore. So we have these huge devices. They're round. They're about 2 feet in diameter. They're round metal tubes that can be 8 to 12 feet long, and we use a piece of equipment to jam them down into the ground, and then we pull them out. They're full of dirt. And at various intervals on these soil bores are little trapdoors. And those trapdoors indicate where science has told us 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 400 years ago. So if we think we maybe want to see what was on the land 400 years ago, we can open one of the trapdoors and take out some soil and analyze it. We can see fossils and little bits of bone of critters and mice and little bits of flowers, and we can find some seeds. So maybe we look at 400 years ago and we realize that that's not possible to restore back to 400 years ago because what we're seeing there in the ground, some of it's extinct, some of it can't be supported by the small amount of land relatively that we have to work with. So then we might go up to 200 years and we take a look at what was growing on that ground 200 years ago. And maybe we see that there were zero red maples or sugar maples. So that tells us that these red maples are not native to that piece of land. So what we do is we cut them down. We do an inventory first, and then we cut them down, anything that was not native based on our soil bore. And then we go in and we tag and inventory. We put a little tag on the tree. Anything like a hickory or an oak tree, we always leave the hickories and the oaks, no matter what, we always leave them. And then we take the trees that we've cut down and we save a little bit of the trunk and the root. And after we have, we also do a thing where we block off the river so that the riverbed becomes dry. And when there's about 1.5 to 2 inches of water in there, we get a bunch of volunteers. Everybody runs into the drained part of the river and we scoop up all the critters we can find, all the fish and the snail and the little bugs, and we take them upriver so they can continue to live in the water while we're doing our work. Then what we do is it's called remeandering the river. So we build in some twists and turns to get rid of that channelization. And in some cases, we can find aerial maps to show us what the channelization looked like. In other places, we don't have that historical data, but we can look at similar pieces of land and similar rivers, and we can take a look at science that tells us how much channelizing or how much remeandering we need to do. So we essentially reroute the river or the stream. And then what we do is we take those cut down root wads that we've pulled out and we position them along the banks of the remeandered river. And then what we do is we open the floodgates and let the river come running back in, and it covers those root wads. So then we can plant plants right into those root wads, and the root wads have the job of stopping erosion until the plants take hold. But we can get the plants right into the root wads without having to wait for them to take hold. They're already there. And by the time 10, 15 years, by the time the root wads have kind of done their thing and disintegrated back into nature, into the soil, the plants have taken hold. And now they're doing their job of keeping erosion at bay. Meanwhile, also, all those little critters that were put upstream can now rush downstream and they can start setting up housekeeping inside the root wad. So fish can lay their eggs, little other critters can set up a nest, bugs can do their thing and kind of be ready to dart out and be eaten by frogs. Frogs can get in there and live. So by the time the root rods have disintegrated, all of the native vegetation and native critters that live in the water have started to take hold. So the root rods get used and get sent back to nature. So this is the very area. If you look at the top color photo, you see that bunch of root wads, and then you see the water meandering and the green trees in the background. That is the exact same area where I just showed you those broken down drain tiles. So look how nice it looks now. Next slide. So here is, again, the exact same piece of land. If you look, you can kind of see the drain tiles being broken in the middle of the um, photograph here. You can see where that little white branch is kind of pointing. There's a dark round circle. Um, and you can see where one of the drain tiles is broken off there. This is now on the other side is what it looks like after it's been re-meandered and had the root wads placed in. So next slide. This is what that area looked like 2 years after the restoration project. And the next slide. This is what it looked like 6 years later. So you can see that while on the surface it looks like we cut down a wooded area, what we did was we took it back to what it should be. We did a lot of this reseeding, but once the ground has been cleared and put back the way it should be naturally, and we've restored the natural water flow and taken out the drain tiles, a lot of plants do what we call volunteer. The seed bed that's down in the ground that we can look at with those soil bores, the seeds start volunteering and coming up on their own. So next slide. That's the restoration and mitigation project portion of our natural area restoration. Now we often can get grant money for that, which is lovely. Sometimes organizations like the Illinois Tollway destroy a chunk of wetland, like when they put in the 355 the Elgin O'Hare toll road extension, they destroyed a wetland. They have to pay that money back to restore a wetland somewhere else, and the county can disperse that to the forest preserve to be used in restoring a wetland, which is what you just saw there. The other advantage is all those native plants, like the echinacea, those purple plants that were in that last picture, they have roots that are 6, 8, and 10 feet deep. Some native plants have 12 feet deep roots. So when it floods, when we get a big rain event now, instead of zooming downstream and flooding in Naperville, what happens is the floodwaters go out into the prairie as they should, and they soak into the ground, and the native plants suck them up. So we eliminate flooding by restoring the land back to doing what it was meant to do. So just to show you kind of where we're at here, we take out the drain tiles, we mitigate the development by putting the land back to where it is. We do natural fires, and we're going to now move into the other 4 things that we do that are less dramatic, but really satisfying if you're a volunteer. So seed collection and invasive species removal is our next slide. We go out at different times of the year. Again, we know from science, some plants have to be over winter on the plant. The seeds have to be over the winter to get frozen and thawed and frozen again before they're really ready to germinate. So those plants, we have volunteers and employees out right now pulling the seeds off those plants and getting them ready. We have other plants that we pick in the spring or in the fall, and then we clean them and we get them ready, and then we put them in a controlled refrigerated environment to mimic what nature would have done to them had they been outdoors pre climate change into a natural winter, like the kind of winter I knew when I was a child where it was pretty cold the whole time. Then we can take those seeds out and plant them, and they will grow because they've been germinated according to the way they were intended to germinate. So we have a lot of different seed cleaning and seed collecting operations. So for a number of years, I was the volunteer in charge of the seed cleaning operation for the Morton Arboretum, and they clean not tons, but pounds and pounds of seeds. And when you think about like a little teeny dandelion seed, imagine cleaning like 30 pounds of those seeds and getting them ready for the spring to be out there planted. So what we do with the seed cleaning is we try as much as possible to mimic whatever era we decided to restore the land to, like 200 years ago. We can look up and see what the climate was back then. So we mimic the climate conditions then, and we try as best we can to help the seeds be ready to grow after having had an artificial but similar environment to the one that they needed. The more native plants that you grow, the fewer invasive species can grow because there isn't room for them anymore. The next slide, we do invasive species management. So we have a lot of volunteers who cut buckthorn, garlic mustard. It's just the season for garlic mustard. We want to get out and pick that as much as we can. And of course, honeysuckle, burning bush, all those invasive species that are out there. Invasive species are kind of hard to control because birds and eat the seeds and then carry them around and poop out in another location. They take hold. Critters come and either eat the seeds and again defecate somewhere else and the seeds can grow. But critters also walk through and catch the seeds on their fur and carry it along with them. So invasive species kind of get around. I don't think they will ever be eradicated. So we do what we can by cutting and removing the invasive species, but we also do herbicide to keep these at bay. And for people who are concerned about the use of herbicides, I used to have an herbicide license. You have to go to a week-long training and take a pretty hard test. I typically pass the test by 1 or 2 points, so it's a hard test. You have to know a lot about wind and about how to mix the herbicide and what kind of poison you're being used for what kind of plant. And then we don't just do wholesale spraying. What we do is we might cut a buckthorn bush down and haul it away. And then somebody comes by with a long wand with a sponge attached to it. And the herbicide is colored in a blue color so you can see it. And we just dab the cut off stump with the herbicide. So we're not spraying it all over. We're just killing the roots of that one buckthorn so that it won't resprout and come back. And then we don't have to go back and herbicide it again. And there's no risk of that because anyone coming by with herbicide can see that that area, that cut stump is already blue. We don't have to do it again. So we do use some herbicide, but again, there's a lot of hard science behind how we do it. And we are so careful. We don't even bring herbicide into the building. We have a great respect for this, and we're very cautious about how and when we use it. So our next slide, we do prescribed burning. And I do have some slides I could send you that show this actually happening. But again, you have to go to 2 days of classes and pass a test in order to be on what we call a burn team or a crew. There's a lot of science that goes into the burning. Also, we have to look at atmospheric conditions. We have to look at wind. We have to look at how much sun is there or not there. We also have to look at what's happening 2 layers above the atmosphere that we're breathing right now, because we don't want to set off some smoke, have it get up and have another warm front push the smoke back down. So we manage that as best we can. What's important for you to know is if we do send out a card, I believe it's a bright orange card, and you'll get it in your mailbox that says we're going to be doing prescribed burns in your area over the next 2 months. So you know we're going to be doing burning. If you have asthma or if you have a condition or you just don't want the smoke getting into your house and you're worried about that, all you have to do is call us. We put your name on a list, and the day before we do a burn, we call you or we send you an email and we say burning tomorrow in your neighborhood. So you know then that you can leave or close your windows, whatever you need to do to protect your own breathing. We can put you on a list and make sure that that happens. And everyone does get notified. It isn't like a list that just sits there. We want you to protect your health, and we want to help you do that. Now you see this big pile of clouds here on the screen, the black and white one. That was about 30 feet high when it was burning, and it was pretty much something to see. and it dissipated in under a minute. So we're not creating burning that sends up smoke and it stays forever. Again, because we pay close attention to the atmosphere. Now you see these guys here walking along. They're carrying a backpack filled with some kind of fuel, and then they have a wand, and it's called a drip torch. So they walk along the area where we're starting the burn, and then it's meant to burn inward toward the forest preserve, not outward toward civilization. You walk the perimeter, and you just drop little bits of sparks and flame, and it all catches. It's kind of cool to watch. Okay, next slide. Here is actually part of a burn that's happening over by uh, Herrick Lake. So this one took up pretty much. Next slide. Now let's talk about targeted critter management. Um, Again, if you remember 1939, there wasn't much civilization around the forest preserve at West Branch, and now there is. So those deer have to go somewhere, and the raccoons have to go somewhere. Next slide. You can see their habitat has been sucked up by civilization. If you look at this little picture here with a hole in it, and around that you can kind of see there's some turtle eggs. Turtles are like the worst parents on the planet. They lay their eggs, they kind of brush a little dirt over it, and then they walk off. Raccoons have amazingly learned how to tell when a female turtle is pregnant, and they will follow her for up to 2 days until she lays her eggs. So she's like 300 feet away, and the eggs have already been eaten. So we need to manage raccoons. Deer, DuPage County has the fifth lowest rate in the United States of car and deer accidents, and that's because we target manage the deer. We also have got the lowest rate of deaths by deer and car interactions in the state. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Coyotes, of course, possums are around. I don't know about you, but I have possums all the time in my yard, and they're kind of mean. They snarl all the time. And of course, raccoons are just waiting for a handout every time you turn around. So back to the deer for a minute. We don't just wholesale shoot deer. We go up in helicopters when there's snow on the ground. There is a formula that the state gives us, we don't make it up, that says how many deer an acre of land can support before they have to start wandering off and getting in the roads and eating your snapdragons. So we go up when there's snow on the ground with trained employees from the state, not our employees, but from the state. We go up in helicopters and they count the deer in the preserves. And then they come back down and they work out the formula. And we decide which preserves have an overabundance of deer, and we take into account how some preserves connect, and one preserve might have an overabundance of deer, but next door is one that doesn't. So we maybe are going to cull less deer because we realize they could walk over to the other preserve and even out the balance. Deer also are very hard on the environment. They eat a lot of trees and plants that are good for the environment and good for other critters. So once we have a count, we have to apply for permits to the state. We can't just go shoot them. Once we get the deer culling permits, we establish a couple of dates. We put out bait in areas away from streets and away from homes, and we hire sharpshooters who are employees of the state of Illinois. So the deer cluster around, and at 3 in the morning, our sharpshooters go out and shoot the deer once in the head. It's about the most humane way possible. Now, personally, I don't like the idea that we kill anything, but we have to in order to mimic what nature used to do. Back in the day, we didn't have roads, so deers didn't go scampering across the street causing accidents. We also would, back in the day, 200 and 300 years ago, we would shoot a deer and eat it and then use the hide for clothing. So what the forest preserve does, the deer is not owned by us, it's owned by the public. So what we do is we take the deer with a contract to a processing plant and have it turned into venison sausage, and then we give it to the food banks to hand out to the public. So it it is not a stretch for me to see that we are just mimicking what nature used to do. We would shoot a deer, we would eat it, we would use as much of it as we could for our own nutrition, and then we would go on about living on the land. And that's what we try to mimic with our deer culling program. If the state thinks we're asking for too many permits to kill deer based on our count, we only get how many they think we should be able to kill. So again, there's oversight. Now look at coyotes. Coyotes are, they're, to me, they're like the cockroaches of the mammal world. You know how they say after a nuclear war, the cockroaches will still be here? So will the coyotes. When we try to manage coyotes, we get people calling all the time saying, come and get this coyote and relocate it because it's wandering around my neighborhood. Well, an interesting thing about coyotes is that if you try to manage the population by moving them or killing some off, they have more pups every year. If we leave them alone, they have 1 or 2 pups. If we try to manage the population, they can have up to 10 or 12 pups in a season. So somehow they know what's going on. And the best thing to do with a coyote is keep your small pets on a leash. Don't let them out in the yard on their own without being supervised. And if you see a coyote, quietly turn and walk the other way. The more we try to manage them, the more coyotes you will have. Possums, now I have a whole new take on possums, and I don't like them anyway. But a possum darted out in November, darted out, got under my car, caused $6,000 worth of damage, a little old possum, and then ran off. It wasn't even hurt, as near as I could tell. I couldn't catch it. It was gone. And there was no blood and no fur. But it bent my radiator, took out my air conditioner, busted up some headlamps, caused so much damage on the inside of the car that my entire front end had to practically be rebuilt and replace some of the outside parts. It knocked out a headlight. So those possums are kind of more robust than you might think. They do eat their weight in ticks every year. So if you have not been bitten by a tick, thank a possum. And of course, raccoons. I don't know what to do about raccoons. Nobody does. They're just there. Keep your garbage locked up and keep tight lids on things and don't feed them. That at least might keep them out of your neighborhood. Okay, next slide. This is the most fun thing that we do. This is a Heinz emerald dragonfly larva. So the Heinz emerald dragonfly is a cute little dragonfly. It's an ugly larva, but this is what they are. When we put in the 355 extension back in 2007-ish, the engineers thought they were doing the right thing, and they raised the bridge up so that it would not ruin the habitat for the Heinz emerald dragonfly. But they accidentally put the bridge right in the mating flight path, so it actually decimated the population. There are only 2 tiny, tiny populations of Heinz emerald dragonfly in DuPage in the world, and they're here in DuPage County. So there aren't very many elsewhere that we know of. Next slide. The interesting thing about the Heinz emerald dragonfly is it looks kind of ugly. It will stay in that state for 3 to 5 years before it can hatch and become a dragonfly. Once it hatches, it flies around and it lives for about 6 weeks. So what we do is we go out and we catch the dragonflies once they've hatched, and we dip their tails in water, which makes them think they're mating, and they drop their eggs. So we now have at our Urban Stream Resource Center over at Blackwell, we have a Heinz emerald dragonfly rearing tank. So we get those little larvae. Now here's the next thing. Those little larvae have to be laid in a stream that has have a streamlet, not a full stream, a streamlet that has a heavy concentration of dolomite. Dolomite is a kind of calcium-like thing. They have to be laid in a devil crayfish burrow where they will live for 3 to 5 years before they're ready to pop out and hatch as a actual dragonfly. You would think the devil crayfish and the Heinz emerald dragonfly get along, but they don't. The Heinz emerald dragonfly the larva is eaten by the devil crayfish. But yet that's the only place they will lay their eggs, in a devil crayfish burrow in a streamlet that has a high concentration of dolomite. So one of the things the forest preserve does, all of our ecologists have bit up fingers from dangling their hands into little holes looking for devil crayfish. But we now have a program where it was starting at the start of COVID, so it's just going to be starting up again in the fall, where we have devil crayfish tanks and we give them to junior high schools to raise in their classroom as part of their science project. Then we have created little habitats with dolomite heavy streams exactly the way they should be. And then we take we release the Heinz emerald dragonflies into those areas once they've hatched, and we put the devil crayfish into the burrows. So we're creating a habitat for them. We also get the little tiny larvae, and we raise them in a perfect environment in the runway. It's a simulation of a streamlet for them. And because they're protected and they have good nutrition and perfect conditions, we can sometimes release them, have them hatch as soon as 2 years. And then we release them back into the wild where we try to catch them later and get their eggs. So that's just one project. Another interesting project that we do, and I unfortunately don't have a slide of it, is the catch and release Baltimore checker spot butterfly. So a Baltimore checker spot butterfly is tiny. It's about the size of the first joint of your little finger. They're going extinct in some parts of Illinois, but not in DuPage County. So they're a little cluster of butterflies. They will only lay their eggs on white turtlehead plants. White turtlehead plants will only grow in a certain type of marshy area. So we have one colony in DuPage County. Now, if they can't find a white turtlehead plant, they just stay sitting there and don't lay their eggs. So they're kind of a little homogeneous community. They don't move around like monarchs do. So if their habitat goes away, they go away. So what we've done is we've been out for 10 years and we go out every summer and we catch them. We mark their wing with magic marker, which doesn't hurt them. And then we release them and we go back and do that again until we have a count for the area. Meanwhile, over those 10 years, we went 600 feet away and recreated a habitat for them. We mimicked the habitat that they were in by creating the exact marsh with the exact soil and water conditions, with the exact kind of white turtle head, everything. And after 6 years, we got them to move 600 feet and start a new colony. So now we are able to tell areas where they have endangered populations of the Baltimore checker spot that they can create a colony, a habitat in which a colony will move and start themselves again. So now we have two colonies, and now we're working on a third. Again, kind of cool. And then the most important, most interesting one we do is the endangered Blandings turtle. We started back in the 60s doing an inventory of all the land that we owned. We discovered in the 70s that we were catching a lot of adolescents and adults, but no baby Blandings turtles. So that led to what we call a Head Start program, where we capture adults who are pregnant. And you can see on the big turtle here that there's a little transmitter device glued to their shell. Doesn't hurt them. We bring them into Willowbrook Wildlife Center where we induce labor in this turtle with the exact same chemicals that we use to induce human labor. Not we, the forest preserve, but that are used to induce labors in humans. We get the eggs. We put the transmitter on the female, take her back into the place where we found her, and then we go back next year with a device that shows us where they are and catch them, get the eggs again. So if you look at these turtles and then we raise them for about a year, they don't reach maturity to be able to reproduce until they're about 14 years old. And until they're about a year old, they're so tiny that they're nothing but a morsel for a raccoon to crunch. So we raise them in a habitat. We put little numbers on their back and we raise them, we parcel them out. So Brookfield Zoo has some, Cosley Zoo has some, they're kind of parceled out all over. And after about a year and a half of being reared in our nice environment, they get a great diet. They don't have to hibernate because they're climate controlled. And we hatch the eggs at a rate of about 60% female and 40% males. You can control that by the temperature of the incubating box. We then release them out into the wild and we put little transmitters under their left armpit so that we can go find them again. We also put a notch on their shell, which doesn't hurt them, but it allows us to identify them. And we take a picture of their plastron, which is their belly, because their markings on their belly are as unique as human fingerprints. So, excuse me, you can see what we have here. We have a great grandmother, a grandmother, a mother, and a baby, all from the same family. But that baby is the only one that was hatched in the wild, or that was, excuse me, pardon me, um, was hatched in our labs from a turtle that was hatched in our lab. Excuse me. We are just about done, and you can see I've reached my limit of almost talking. So if you look at this chart, you can see that the blue lines are the ones that were hatched in our Head Start program, and the green are the ones that are hatched in the wild. So if you look all the way over to 2016, you can see that we have increased the population of Blanding's turtles. But if you take away the blue area where that we've hatched in our labs, you could see that there would be a declining population. Now you can, if you want, your organization or your church or your Girl Scout group, for $100, you can sponsor a Blandings turtle. And what you get from that is you get to name it. I have one. I've named him Little Waylon Jennings. And then you get a certificate of birth signed by a delivering ecologist with a picture of your turtle coming out of an egg and a little tiny turtle footprint. And then they give you updates. So little Waylon Jennings has been released into the wild, but they haven't relocated him yet. So I hope he's okay. But when they find the turtles, they let people know that the turtles have been found. Next slide, please. So you can adopt a Blandings turtle through our Head Start program. We can go on to the next slide. And I just want to kind of wrap this up by saying that all of the natural areas restoration work we do, you can help. Baby steps work. So you can reduce your impact. You can ride your bike to work 1 day a week. You can adjust your own attitude. Instead of getting mad at the forest preserve and calling us when you see us doing something or getting worried about your property taxes, send me an email or call our district headquarters. We really, really want to talk to you about the science involved in what we do. We love doing that. We want you to understand what we do, and we want you to know that it's based on science and that there are very many checks and balances in what we do. And you can get involved. So the next slide. You can take a class like this and learn. You can volunteer, and of course, we will happily allow you to donate money. Next slide. So I just want to end this here with the idea that this can be for you a life-changing moment. You can, if you want to, go home and or stay home if you're watching this on Zoom, and you can just say, well, that was interesting, and go on about your life. Or what you could do is say, wow, I learned something about nature and natural areas in DuPage County. I'm going to rethink my attitude, or I am going to um, maybe volunteer, or I am going to get a book and learn about the names of plants. You can take this presentation and use it to give yourself a baby step and learn a few new things. So with having said that, I thank you very much for your attention. I apologize again for the tech difficulties, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And again, my email sburns@dupageforest.org. Send me an email and I'll send you more information.
Okay, thank you so much, Shannon. We really appreciate all that wonderful information.
Mhm.
And just a reminder, if you have questions, to go ahead and put those into the Q&A or into the chat. We'll take those. I'm just thinking as you provide all that great information and all those wonderful stories, just wondering if you have a favorite project that you've been involved in.
Yeah. My personal favorite project is that Heinz Emerald Dragon thing, because if you have a regular dragonfly, like a pretty one that people like, and the Heinz Emerald Dragonfly larva, and you drop two bloodworms in both of their little containers, the other dragonfly will suck them up in seconds, and the Heinz Emerald Dragonfly just sits there. And the bloodworms lay across it. It takes them forever to figure out to eat. They're just so specific and so not intuitively smart. But when you think about something so tiny, if it disappears, if it goes extinct because of humanity's intervention, we have created a tear or a hole in the fabric of the universe. And if things go extinct all the time, but if they're extinct because of humanity, we've created a hole, and you don't know what bad thing is going to come in. So I like these projects of things that are not cute and fuzzy, but they're so important. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I know that they were doing some burning near our property, and at first it was a little bit alarming, but within 2 weeks, we've got all these native plants sprouting, and
Hmm.
the burning really seemed to be helpful. So, we appreciate all that you're doing, and
Yeah, I have seen at the Morton Arboretum where they burn and the plants are starting to already turn green. They burn, and they all go away, and 10 days later, the wildflowers have sprung up. It's amazing.
it really is. It is. Well, I don't see any other questions. So with
Okay.
that, we will close. Shannon has given me some links, and we have some other information to send out to you tonight. So if you've registered for this program, you will receive that in an email later tonight. If you're viewing this recording at a later date and would like those links, just email me at ce@wheatonlibrary.org. That's CE for community engagement at wheatonlibrary.org, and I'd be happy to send those links out to
And
you.
I'm going to send you the link for the wildflowers. I'm going to do that right now.
Great, great. I will
Okay,
be
great.
sure to include that. All right. Well, thank you
Okay.
again to everyone who attended tonight. Take care of everyone. Stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon.